basically so this stuff is
The Governance and Policy Committee meeting of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents will now come to order.
yeah.
You make your way to your seats, that would be great. As we proceed with our first item, I would thank our colleagues Regent Anderson and Regent Omari for their good work yesterday. Regent Beeson and I are committed today to proving that we can do our work in half the time. We will start with the first item on our agenda, Board of Regents Policy, Institutional Conflict of Interest, the change in financial disclosure requirements. This is an action item, and I ask Chief Compliance Officer Boyd Coomer to please join us. Mr. Coomer?
Thank you, Chair Rocha. So I was here in September where I brought forward the said policy. And if you recall, the proposed changes reduced the number of individuals and a list of university officials who are required to file financial disclosures annually from 180 to 51. The proposal also continues to offer special designation lists where senior leaders may identify who should file a fiduo annually. As I stated in September, I believe that this proposal reduces the compliance burden of 129 fiduo filers, that's the financial disclosure filers, and the staff of the Conflict of Interest program without making a material change to the university's institutional conflict of risk profile.
Thank you. Members, are there any comments? Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Thank you.
Thank you.
I favor this move because the compliance policy is only as good as compliance with it and our ability to monitor that compliance. And I think this simplifies things to make it more manageable, and that alone is worthy. But I do think that when we take any compliance policy on or change it, we need to then see how indeed it does work. So I would ask that at some point in a year or so, we have a report on how people are complying with the policy.
Thank you, Chair Rocha, Regent Simmons. I think that is a perfectly reasonable request and something that I would hope that I would do anyway. So I will certainly do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Simmons, may the chair take your comments as a motion to proceed with the action?
Move to approve.
We have a motion. Is there a second? Regent Omari seconds. Continuing discussion. Any additional comments from members of the board? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Director Boyd, Kumar, I think I asked last time what the savings would be. I mean, I thought the discussion originally came to us about how we could reduce the cost of compliance. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I believe I did ask if there would be any savings because the numbers are relatively small.
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Chair Rocha, Regent Hsu, getting ahead of myself. You did bring that up, as a matter of fact, and I at the time I explained, and this still holds true, that the 129 filers that we would be eliminating from this, from my office, from the conflict of interest program's point of view, because we have not had any issues with those individuals historically, which is part of the impetus for this. The burden would be, the reduction in my office would be low. But for those 129 filers, and this is where the cost of compliance becomes difficult to quantify, it really depends on what their individual situations look like. Those who have more extensive assets would have to spend more time filing than those individuals who had very little. I can tell you when I file the fiduo, it takes me about 5 minutes. but for others, they may have more holdings. But I think that this is really part of the larger idea of the cost of compliance and the compliance burdens that we're placing on individuals, and making sure that we have right size compliance, that we're doing those things which we need to do to gain a reasonable assurance that the institution's officials and the institution itself is within its regulatory requirements and within the requirements of our policies and procedures, without going so far as to just sort of stack up these additional burdens, because compliance can be the death by many cuts sort of idea as well.
Regent Hsu, follow-up?
Yeah, a quick follow-up, Chair Rocha. So let's say you have someone who has a very complicated situation. Are we talking about days to fill it out, or are we talking about just hours?
So that's a good question. I asked that question as well of my program director, John Gooden, and John felt that it could take some of these individuals several hours or even a day to fill out this information, those who have the more extensive holdings.
Regent Simmons.
Just one question for you. On the appendix, that's page 8 of our docket material, other individuals required to file. I was just wondering, the director of the Wiseman Art Museum is on that list, but not the director of the Bell Museum. Is there a reason for that difference?
Mr. Coomer.
Thank you, Regent Chair Rocha. Regent Simmons, I would have to go back and look into why one was omitted over the other, but I would certainly be willing to do that.
May I?
Please.
The Bell Museum has taken on a little bigger life than it was before, so it may be that it's appropriate, or it may be different in the world of art than it is in the world of natural science or something. I don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Coomer, do you want to comment, or?
Only insofar as that we will go back and take a look at that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And if I may, Chair Rocha and Regent Simmons, that's the benefit to having the special designation list is we can add names as necessary to that list. So it does allow us that flexibility.
Thank you. That's an interesting catch. Regent Beeson.
Oh, I thought you were.
Oh, Regent Beeson, it's good to see you.
Just don't call me.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I would point out that at the information discussion on this, we made a request to our general counsel. We did receive a memorandum that talked about other protections that we have in relation to these positions. It is unusual in today's era of compliance to see, what would appear to be a withdrawing of oversight in a specific way, but I think that actually reflects a very thoughtful approach to these matters. And so, at least from my perspective, the response that we received from General Counsel was adequate from my perspective to feel comfortable that we still have rules in place. Obviously doesn't guarantee anything, and we'll have to continue to keep our minds on those things. Any other comments from any of the members of the committee? Hearing none, we'll move to a vote. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. I think we got it. And all those opposed, the motion carries. Thank you. We'll move to the second agenda item, board operations. This is part 2. Mr. Steves will make his way to the table. Meeting procedures and emergency approval. This is up for discussion. Mr. Steves.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as noted, this is part 2 of this conversation. Today we'll focus on meeting procedures and emergency approvals. And just as a preview, in December, there will be some discussion and focus on legislative reports and presidential performance review, evaluation, and compensation, which are just additional segments of that policy. So by then, we will hopefully have rounded out the review phase of this, and we'll be able to go back to the workshop and develop some red line changes to bring back for the committee to consider. So, meeting procedures. BOAG, or Board Operations Agenda Guidelines Policy, outlines several ways that items come to this board for consideration, and these would be very, very familiar to you because they're marked on every docket item summary. An item is coming for review, which is, well, I'll walk through them in just a bit. Review action, which all in one meeting, discussion, or other. So as we walk through these, review is simply where you are discussing or evaluating or asking questions about a particular item. It's your opportunity to consider it and then potentially have a gap in time when you can gather additional input from stakeholders or others before you take an action on it. Action, obviously, are items that have previously been reviewed and are coming back for now a vote or consideration by the board. And there are a couple examples of each of these on slides as we work through it. Review action together are situations when you are both hearing the item or discussing it for the first time in a meeting and then taking action in that same meeting. Certainly items like consent reports would be a perfect example of review action in one meeting, but certainly there have been other instances when you have done review action in a meeting because there are time sensitivities associated with the particular item or some other factor. When review action occurs in one meeting together, it is with the permission of the board chair through the agenda setting process. And then there are items for discussion. And in some cases, a discussion item is simply to help the board understand an item in greater depth. But in other cases, a discussion item is also maybe foreshadowing or kind of a precursor to a subsequent review action item. And there are some examples there as well. And then information items and receive and file reports are simply ways that information can be provided to the board via the docket. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. The other thing that I wanted to touch on today is emergency approvals. And the policy permits the president to submit to the board chair, the board vice chair, and the chair of the respective committee, depending on what the topic is, an item for action or a request for action when delay, and this is the quote, when delay for board approval poses a significant health, safety, or financial risk to the university. And then that action taken by the chair, vice chair, and respective committee chair will be brought to the next meeting of the board consistent with board policy. That last phrase has actually been one that is a little bit confusing, to be honest, because if the approval is happening in between the meetings and then it is brought to the next meeting consistent with board policy, what does that mean? Does that mean that the board then votes on it again, or that the board could reject the action that was taken, or what does that mean? So that's one where at minimum we would hope to try to clarify that a little bit to better articulate what exactly that subsequent step is that's taken. And we'll talk through potentially any feedback you have about the emergency approval process as well. Just to give you a sense of how frequently the emergency approval occurs, since 2014 we looked back, and since 2014 there have been 8 emergency approvals that have occurred. So they're not highly frequent, but 2-3 a year. All right, so I'll move to discussion questions, because as I noted the last time we had this conversation, this is really about gathering your input and feedback so that we can bring you red line changes that hopefully align with where you want to take these policies in the future. So I'll just run through these, and then it can be open for conversation. Should additional guidance or specific thresholds be added to the policy to clarify the types of items that are eligible or would come to the board for review action in a single meeting? Should additional guidance be added for the types of items included on a consent report, in part because a consent report is a review action in one meeting as well? And then in those instances when emergency or urgent approval is needed between board meetings, is the current process adequate, or should there be some kind of change to that process? And then of course also how and when should those approvals be reported to or considered by the full board in some manner? So those are the key questions that we have as we try to evaluate possible changes to bring to you.
Thank you, Mr. Steves. That's a good setup for our conversation. The floor is now open for a conversation, I think, about any of these questions. Do we have any comments from members of the board? Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Rocha, and thanks for the work on this. I'm quite satisfied with most of the policy as it is. The one thing I think is that the last question, how and when should such approvals be reported to the full board? I think it's important that the full board be informed fairly quickly about those kinds of decisions. Even though it's a decision that's already been made, I think it's important that the board be informed. So I'd say fairly promptly.
Thank you, Regent Cohen. Mr. Steves, did you want to comment, or it stands on its own? Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really on the heels of those comments, and I don't know how to memorialize this into these guidelines, but this is really about communication on items that rise to the level that we're going to do that ahead of time. That we're going to be bringing for review action, or alerting people as quickly as possible on emergency. It's really about informal communication quickly, and I think the administration does that generally, but I think when these items do arise, either review action or emergency, is sort of using the informal communication channels, either in writing or picking up the phone.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Secretary Steves, could you please give us an overview of the 8 emergency approvals that you mentioned that have been used recently?
Mr. Steves.
Sure. There were, of those items, and I'm just going to try and classify them as I look over the list here, it appears that there were 2 real estate transactions. There were 2 related to retention of external legal counsel and establishment of an oversight committee related to work that council was going to do back in 2015. There was one that was related to a purchase of goods and services over $1 million. One related to engagement of an audit firm, and 2 related to the design or final review of a real estate project.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Do you believe all of those in all of those cases that the emergency approval process was properly used?
Mr. Steves.
Or
Regent Hsu, could you maybe clarify the question? Do you mean, was the threshold met, or was it properly implemented?
Well, and was it really required? Because what I'm trying to get to here is whether or not the emergency, what we don't want to have is emergency approvals made where the entire board maybe could have been consulted and an emergency board meeting conducted if there was truly an emergency. But what I want to make sure of is that we don't have 3 people on the board making decisions and then forcing that decision on the rest of the board at a future board meeting, because it does have to, an emergency approval, as I understand it, has to be approved then by the entire board at the next board meeting.
Well, Regent Hsu, I think actually one of the questions that was raised is, what does bringing it back to the board mean? Does it require ratification? It appears open-ended, which may be the right answer, but I believe Mr. Steves raised that as a question. Mr. Steves can answer if he wants, but I don't know that I would want to put him on the spot to get his opinion about whether the threshold was met. That would seem to be a subjective determination by the board members. Mr. Steves, you can respond to the question if you want, but I just don't want to put you in that position.
Mr. Chair, I would just say that in each case the process was followed, and so the process as outlined in the policy was followed as outlined. So you're right, though, in terms of the subjectiveness of deciding whether these items rose to the level of needing an emergency approval or not would be up to the board.
Regent Simmons, to the point?
Yes, to this point, my experience with this on this board has been that only requests that were really appropriate, that needed a timely approval, came forward, but were not at a level of substance that would suggest an emergency meeting of the whole board was needed. It's generally something to efficiently make a decision to carry on with business. That's least been my experience. So both the administration and the board leadership have handled them well and appropriately, in my opinion.
Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. So my question has to do with, are we aware of other approaches to emergency or urgent approvals? So for instance, I'm aware of one alternative which involves online approval of a resolution, and as soon as you get to a quorum of members who have approved online, you in essence have approval from a quorum of the board. So that's an example, but I guess the question is, are there alternatives out there that we have considered?
Mr. Steves.
Mr. Chair and Regent Powell, we have not surveyed other Big Ten institutions or peer institutions to see what kinds of processes they have in place, but we could do some of that looking before we bring back red line changes, and we'll take a look at that. In terms of processes that might be more efficient in like an electronic approval, that would be something that is not permitted under the open meeting law for this board. It would be a good option, and I would really enjoy it, but but no, it's not permitted.
But, Mr. Steves, that raises a very interesting point, because from a public policy standpoint, an email exchange is something that would be discoverable, reviewable, whereas a private decision by 3 members of the board in a non-public way would be far less accessible. So how would emergency approvals in that context, how does that interact with the open meeting law? Because you have a decision being made by on behalf of a public body in a non-public way.
Mr. Chair, my understanding of it would be is if a decision is submitted to the board electronically and board members are weighing in and voting via email, that would constitute a meeting or an action of the board. Whereas with the emergency approval, the way the board has outlined it is delegating this responsibility to 3 members of the board who independently look at it. They do not meet. They independently look at the item before them. They offer their view on it, and then it moves forward.
Yeah, this is it's a whole can of worms that I hadn't thought of before, because when the board delegates that authority to the 3, you've created a committee with authority. And to the extent that there's that conversation, I'd be interested in what General Counsel's perspective is on that. Because certainly it would seem to me that an email exchange among the larger body would actually have more adherence to, or would have the capacity for more adherence to. So I'm interested in that. Because it goes back a little bit to, Regent Simmons posed a question that I think is pretty fundamental. Because the concept of emergency is not a matter of whether it's more appropriate for the 3. It's really a matter of whether it's impossible for the 12. That's why, because it's a approval requirement that requires the whole board's authority, and it's just not possible to pull the 12 together. Not a function of it's easier for the 3, because it would always be easier for 3, I would assume, in virtually any situation. So I would be very interested to understand that. And ensure that the process that we currently have is in compliance as well. Because I think that when Regent Powell said that, certainly that's common among other organizations, and that'd be great if we would have that ability on that, to have that kind of input. Further questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, allow me and members to think out loud for a moment about the situation. As Mr. Steves listed the situations, I recall being involved in some of these, especially real estate. And I think if you look at our policies and bylaws and the responsibilities and authority given to the chair and the vice chair on behalf of the board, and typically what comes to mind is these are real estate transactions. And let's just say that a real estate transaction has been pending, And on Monday, coming Monday, things come together, but the board does not meet until December, whatever, that's 45 to 60 days. And on behalf of the university, I think it's important that there is individuals, officers, regents that can make that decision, and then it's reported back to the board. I mean, that's a practical sense. Now, what you raised, Regent Rocha, is does the board or the leadership have authority to do that? And I understand that, but sometimes you just have to make the decision. Or in the case of hiring outside counsel or whatever, you just can't wait. I have no problems with the board being informed. I think that's very good. It's timely, it's transparent. So I think that is a practical matter on the list that was given to us by Mr. Steves, what happened in most of these situations.
Thank you, Regent Johnson. I'm not sure that characterized what I was saying entirely, but your point is I think well taken. Further comments, Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an interesting conversation. Technology does allow us to potentially do business in ways that we couldn't otherwise, but that does trigger the notification of the open meeting law, and that could be a concern. There are issues that come that the emergency, in terms of the emergency approvals, things that maybe have to get decided within a day. But then most of them are items that have urgency, and that can't wait for 2 months or a month, which could be, we could solicit approval on through email and some sort of electronic means.
Thank you. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. To the extent it's helpful, I just make an observation, having had the opportunity to serve with my colleague to the right and in committee chair roles and now in a chair of the board role. I would read the word emergency as though it's in blinking bright letters and would apply this provision with extreme judiciousness. It's going to be rare occasions when it's been used and rare occasions when it would be used, but I think good governance demands that we have something in place for the rare emergency situations where it's needed. But just if my own perspective is helpful, I throw that out there.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. And so, from my perspective, there's no question you have to have that. If you have a threshold, let's say, of $1 million, and you have, the Washington Avenue Bridge is teetering and it's about to fall, and to bring a contractor in to secure it is going to be $2 million, you need to have that ability to make that determination on the spot. But my sense is that's an emergency, and that's why it talks about health, safety, and you may have a situation where we have we have millions of dollars in investments, and there's some indication that those investments are going to completely collapse within the next 48 hours. And, what would normally require full board approval requires immediate approval. Those would be the very, very limited circumstances. When we talk about, sort of a real estate transactional matter, these are not things that come within, a matter of hours of notice, even though they may have some timeliness issues. But it would seem to me that to be, for fidelity to the concept of an emergency, that we would have other policies in place that would give us the ability to address those things. Did I have Regent Anderson and then Regent Simmons? Regent Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. As I sit here and listen to this, I think the policy is fine. I think that the word, Chair, is judiciousness. We cannot, and you bring up an interesting topic, we cannot substitute a 3-person emergency decision just because we don't want to have a 12-person open meeting law be done. And so I think the judiciousness of your example of the Washington Avenue Bridge or the investments is a perfect example. I just think it's very important that we use it very judiciously when it has to be done. And quite frankly, that's really what leadership is about. And that's, it is difficult to lead this institution, but sometimes those decisions have to be made. They have to be made judicious, or we have to bring everybody else in.
Thank you. Regent Simmons.
I would just say that with authority comes responsibility, and if we give some authority to board leadership, the chair, vice chair, and a committee chair, then they have a responsibility to look at an issue and say, this actually has such sensitivity, the full board should be engaged, and this should be done publicly. Or, this isn't an emergency. If we're going to pick a chair and a vice chair for our group, let's have some confidence in them and charge them with responsibility as well as giving them authority. So I think it's a good policy and an important tool to have to carry on business of what is our budget? I mean, it's pretty big compared to $1 million.
Regent Cohen.
Thanks, Chair Rocha. I agree. I'm fine with the policy, and I also think that it's not only a matter of responsibility and authority, but it's also a matter of trust. We do elect our chair and vice chair, and that we need to, or from my perspective, it's important to trust that they're going to make good decisions about what is an emergency, what isn't, and they would make a good decision about the particular emergency, and that they would then inform the board. And so I'm fine with the policy.
Thank you. Other commentary? Other commentary? Mr. Steeves, I get a sense, I mean, even from my standpoint, the wording of the authorization appears to be fine. It's always going to be obviously a matter of application and how that interplays with our sense of how quickly we as a board can get together on an emergency basis and so on. You raised one of the points that you raised, I think, of interest was what does it mean to what was the language? Bringing it back to the full board. Can you talk a little bit more as to what kind of clarification you're looking for with respect to that language?
Mr. Chair, the board has gone two different ways on this. So in most cases, the board has simply had the emergency action reported to it in an information item at the next meeting that takes place. In, I think, 2 instances of the 8, the board chose to vote to ratify the emergency action that had been taken. It would be helpful to us to know if the board had a preference around how that item comes to the board. If it's coming as an information item, if it's coming for a ratification vote, it would just help us to know exactly how to meet the board's expectations in terms of how you next see that emergency action item.
Are there any thoughts from the committee as far as a preference in terms of how we would address emergency determinations that have been made under the policy at the full board? I'm going to just start calling on people. Whether Regent Simmons.
I think they should be information, because if we're going to give them the authority and responsibility to approve, then to wait for us to approve their approval doesn't make sense to me. And I think we do run some risk of a commitment being made, a contract being signed, and then deciding to make a reversal. So I think they should be information items.
But for clarification, Mr. Steeves, they weren't subsequent approvals per se, they were simply ratifications of the previous action, is that correct?
And that is fine with me as well. I never understand what ratification means and failure to, most importantly, what does failure to ratify mean? That's
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I think it really goes back to whether or not there was a true emergency. And I have concerns not having been chair and not having chaired a committee with some decisions that are made under the emergency approval process, and then just finding out about it at some point, 45 days later, 60 days later in some cases. So I think we do have to, I would like to actually go through and look at these last 8 transactions that are emergency approvals that were made and just see how we're doing in terms of actually defining an emergency where the approval was needed.
Thank you, Regent Hsu. Regent Cohen?
Thanks, Chair Rocha. I guess I have two questions. One, I think Regent Simmons brings up a great point. So what happens, perhaps, if a board does not ratify a decision that was already made? That's my first question. My second question would be if information, we get various things from the board office, would it be breaking the open meeting law if this committee, the chair, vice chair, and the committee chair made a decision, if that was sent to the board, this is a decision that has been made, it will be included in our information items in the docket, so that we wouldn't necessarily have to wait, say, 45 days, or if the spacing was long. So those are the two questions I have.
Mr. Steves, do you have a response to either portion of or either of those questions?
Mr. Chair and Regent Cohen, I also don't know what it would mean if the board chose not to ratify a decision that had already been made and contractual commitments associated with that decision probably already signed. So I also would probably need to spend a little bit of time with our general counsel to see what implications that would even raise. As to the second point, I feel confident that reporting out or providing information about the decision that had been made under an emergency approval sooner would be completely appropriate.
Regent Cohen, follow-up?
Well, then, to me, that would make sense, is that if there was a decision made, that it would be sent to board members as an information item, just so we'd be informed, and then get on with it.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I probably would be in favor of the information approach. As Regent McMillan said, this is really, and Regent Simmons, this is really about trust of a chair and a vice chair and a committee chair to handle those very unusual circumstances that arise. And as I look back, think back on what occasions those might have necessitated, I think we've handled them judiciously. That's a good word. And so I don't think this is broken at all, and I would propose keeping the rest of the policy the same.
Thank you. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I'm thinking back, and I could be wrong, but if I recall on committees in previous years where there was emergency action, getting a notice that there would be a decision made by the chair of the committee in conjunction with the chair of the board as a committee member. So in past years, audit, for example, everyone who was on the audit committee would get a notice saying this was going to happen, and then it would move forward. So one, I guess, is a question as far as is that procedure, and then secondly, that would leave us with only two committees where there might not be information flow to the full board, because now we're meeting as committee of the whole for almost all of the committees. So that puts me at some ease as far as procedurally, if that continues to happen moving forward. Excuse me. And then in the situation where if audit or litigation needs to make some sort of a emergency approval, could we not just send it to the full board?
Mr. Steves.
Mr. Chair and Regent Omari, we probably have not been consistent in practice in terms of how notification has gone out. Maybe in some instances the committee has found out around the time of the approval, and in some cases not. So I think that question in and of itself is probably, along with other comments, is good feedback for how that notification should work going forward.
Regent Omari, follow-up?
I don't know if that helps alleviate some of the concerns that board members have, but if that came into a regular practice, that would help me as I think about emergency approvals.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Just a couple of points. First of all, I want to be on record as saying I support having a emergency decision mechanism. Chair, vice chair, committee chair, and I think it would be, not good governance for us to not have, something like that. as part of our governance policy, so I support that. Having said that, I think that the best decisions are those that are made by a quorum of the full board, and I think we can all agree with that. And so just to extend some of the line of thinking, there are other ways to gather the board on short notice. One is email, one is telephonic, and I just think that if we give ourselves a process that we work through, and in the end, we couldn't get the board together either through telephone or via email to weigh in on this decision, and also, bearing in mind the concerns, important concerns around open meeting. It seems that leads you to a good decision process that said we had to do this, we couldn't do these other alternatives, so we made the call. And it just seems like that's better from a governance standpoint.
Thank you, Regent Powell. Regent Simmons, did you? Okay, thank you. Regent Anderson.
Thank you. I agree with Regent Powell wholeheartedly that we have to have something, but I'm also a little confused when it came up. We said the question was, what if the 3-person emergency or executive board makes a decision and it's not ratified? I'm a little confused by that, because if we aren't giving that 3-person board the power to make a decision instead of the 12 people, all we're doing is telling them, do the best you can right now and pray that it gets ratified. It's my opinion that those 3 people take over for the board in a true emergency and make a binding decision. They shouldn't have to come back to the board a week or 2 weeks later and say, I hope you'd agreed with what I did, because otherwise maybe we don't. Then where are we? So I guess I'd like to know, does that 3-person emergency or executive board have board authority?
Regent Anderson, I think just as a logical basis, clearly there is, and it's being authorized through this language. The consideration of ratification actually has multiple elements, at least from my perspective. One of them is not necessarily seen as adversarial, where the rest of the board is going to come in and disagree with the decision that was made in an emergency. But ratification essentially places support behind the determination and gives the public the perception that the full board is on board with it. By the same token, we are all public officials and we all have personal views and reputations. And one of the advantages of the ratification opportunity is if the emergency determination was to paint Kaufman Union pink, and there are a couple members who think that was an imprudent action, the ratification vote would at least allow them to place on the record that had they voted on it, they would have said no. The implications for the board, if a majority were to choose to not ratify, is more of a board dynamic issue. I think from a legal and contractual standpoint, whatever the leadership did under the authority of the policy would be binding on the university. I think that's highly unlikely. From my perspective, and being sensitive to the fact that this is a really interesting conversation for a board of our variety, because nearly 50% of this board has chaired at one time. We have 5 chairs or former chairs, and so there's a perspective issue. But from my perspective, I like the idea, on behalf of the good people of the 3rd District of the state of Minnesota, to be able to weigh in on decisions that would have an authority requirement for the entire board, in this case vested in the chair and vice chair and committee chair. So, Mr. Peterson, we've talked a couple times about the potential legal implications with respect to the open meeting law. I would throw this little nugget out there. It strikes me as a bit incongruent to say that we would violate the open meeting law if we had an open conversation and vote among the board, but yet we can have open information provided to the entire board and a decision made by 3 people outside of that setting. Do you have a concept of what the open meeting law implications or other legal implications would be based on the questions that have been asked?
Thank you, Chair Rocha. As everybody appreciates, this is an important discussion, ultimately kind of centering on the trust question and how that sort of plays out, case by case. But having said that, a few thoughts trying to maybe frame up sort of the issue, I do think the board could benefit from some good conversation and better definition. For me, it revolves around several points. First, as Regent Hsu said, the definition of emergency and to what extent emergency can slide into expeditious as opposed to an emergency. Second piece to it is my sense in practice that the line between what requires full board action as opposed to delegated authority by the chair and the vice chair to act on behalf of the board is also a bit of an art rather than a science. And so my sense is that in practice, the chair and the vice chair may well be acting within their delegated authority as leadership, but in order to sort of err in favor of deference to the full board, end up sort of following the emergency procedure, even though technically it wouldn't be required because they're acting within the scope of their chair and vice chair authority. So that line is also at work here. Next point is an open meeting law point, that to the extent that the delegated group is truly making a decision on behalf of the full board, and it is a circumstance in which notice is not prudent or provident, either vis-a-vis the rest of the board or vis-a-vis the public, in the same fashion that there should be a mechanism to inform the full board of the action. At the same time, there should be an open meeting law consideration about how to inform the public of this action that's been taken when presumably an open meeting is not available. And then the final, question that everybody has been referencing, that is, what happens if action is taken and there's a ratification procedure, but for whatever reason the full board doesn't believe ratification is appropriate. Regent Roche, I think you essentially hit the nail on the head. That is that the law has, the concept of apparent authority as opposed to actual authority. So in a real estate transaction, as Regent Johnson posed, action, at the behest of the chair and the vice chair in a so-called emergency situation would undoubtedly be binding upon the university, because the other party to the transaction would believe that those signers had apparent authority, and the law would say that action would be binding on the university, even though in fact this board may be of the view that that was not an emergency and those two individuals did not have actual authority. That would then leave at the ratification point the ability of the full board to challenge the action of the vice chair. It would become a governance question, but it would not undo the legal transaction. I hope that helps.
I think that's very helpful. The one point I would make, though, you initiated your comments by saying it's a trust question. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I operate from the perspective that I implicitly trust the chair, vice. It's never a question of whether I trust them. It's also a function of fidelity to my role as an elected member of the board and ensuring that I am providing that input that I've been charged with by the legislature, but and also adhering to all other obligations under open meeting law and so on. Clearly, when we make a determination to grant that authority to some entity, in this case a group of 3, there's a trust that has to be there, and I don't think anyone's challenging the need to provide that. I just don't want to make it, I don't want to give the implication that any question about how this is implemented or how the standard is applied would indicate not trusting the folks that are empowered. It's just a matter of doing our jobs, basically.
And Chair Roche, to be clear, I fully agree with that. I do not mean to say that trust suggests it's a fuzzy question that is totally art and not science. It's more that there are lines here, emergency versus expeditious on a given day of the week, chair, vice chair authority versus full board authority. open meeting law question. When is it a situation where in written form the public should be informed? All of those are judgment calls, and those lines aren't always crystal clear when presented with an emergency situation. So maybe it's more appropriate to say that the rules of the road are good to have well-defined and, as you say, crisply followed, but at the same time, you know, in this sort of particularly emergency situation, there are going to be kind of judgment calls as to how that gets applied, and that's where trust has to be an additional component into the picture. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Thank you. Regent Simmons.
I'd like to see us move forward on this, and I think that the language about what is required, what's standard for emergency approval, when delay for board approval poses a significant health, safety, or financial risk to the university. Now, the word significant requires interpretation. We've decided that the board chair has judgment, and if we don't think the board chair has judgment to make that decision, we ought to change board chairs. And to me, it's if you're going to give people some responsibility, you give them some authority. If you're going to give them authority, they have a responsibility. I think the policy is fine. I'm fine for these items to come through as discussion. I think good governance would say you not only have policy, but you adhere to it, and you prove that you adhere to it. So audit. At some point, I don't think it's urgent, but at some point, audit what we've done with emergency approvals at the board. We'll see what the issues have been, and we'll see what the decisions were procedures followed. And if they weren't, then we don't have a very good policy or a very good leadership, and we can decide which. So I'd like to see us move forward, go ahead with the policy, having emergency procedure come to the board as for information. And if it's deemed by the chair, boy, I really want the board to know I've done this, or I really want consultation with so-and-so because they actually would add value, the chair has that discretion and, in fact, responsibility.
Thank you. This has been a good, robust conversation. We've missed a couple of, I think, important topics. We've talked about what constitutes review action, when that would happen, and one of the points that Regent Beeson and I have talked about is the possibility for a review item with unanimous support to become an action item, again, recognizing the need for the public to have an opportunity to consider items. We don't have time for that conversation now. Mr. Steeves, we will connect with you, I think, the Vice Chair and I, in taking this into consideration for the next phase, but I appreciate Mr. Peterson's input, and thank you. We'll move on to the next agenda item. This is committee charges, Mission Fulfillment Committee for discussion, and Executive Vice President and Provost Karen Hansen and Maggie Latin from the Board of Regents office. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Provost Hansen and I are here to discuss the draft committee charge for the Mission Fulfillment Committee, which was included in your docket materials on page 30. This is the second in a series of conversations to define charges for the board's new committee structure that was adopted last June. As you recall, last month you reviewed the draft charge for the Finance and Operations Committee, and in December you will review draft charges for the Audit and Compliance and this committee, the Governance and Policy Committee. Feedback from today's conversation will be used to refine the draft language, which will be included in proposed amendments to Board of Regents Policy, Board Operations and Agenda Guidelines, BOAG, when it comes to the committee for review in the spring. Those changes will establish the permanent charges for the board's committees under this new structure. Before we walk through the proposed draft, Provost Hansen will comment on the scope of the new committee.
I think you all know, Chair Rocha, members of the committee, the Mission Fulfillment Committee replaces the Academic and Student Affairs Committee and expands its scope to include all elements of mission, teaching, research, and education.
Now, as we walk through the proposed draft, again on page 30, you'll note that it follows the established structure for committee charges with 3 sections. the committee description, items the committee recommends to the full board for approval, and the committee's specific areas of oversight. The first section is the committee's description, which includes the broad duties of the committee. The second section defines the action items that come to the committee for recommendations to the full board. Instead of listing those specific items, this section provides a cross-reference to Board of Regents policy, reservation, and delegation of authority. Specifically, though, the Mission Fulfillment Committee is responsible for reviewing conferral of faculty tenure as well as academic program changes, additions, and discontinuations for full board approval. In comparison to the Finance and Operations Committee, this list is very short, but although the number of action items is small, their impact is great and core to the university's mission, three-part mission. The final section then of the committee charge further details the committee's oversight responsibilities. These areas drive the committee's annual planning and agenda development. For example, just yesterday, the Mission Fulfillment Committee discussed online learning opportunities across the system and began a series of conversation about the university's 21st century outreach mission, which will be revisited at 2 future meetings of the committee. The committee's work plan also for the year ahead calls for agenda items like research startups and technology commercialization, system-wide enrollment planning, and the role of graduate students at research universities.
As Maggie has pointed out, the committee would take over some of the functions of ASA, including academic program changes, additions, and deletions, and it would expand the role of the old ASA to include conferral of faculty tenure. I'd actually ask that you consider whether or not it should also include approval of academic administrators. Right now you have a two-part process, but essentially all of the academic administrators will be coming through with academic appointments. So just a little suggestion about streamlining, and they're chosen basically on the basis of academic credentials and expectations. So that's just a thought. Essentially, the deans and the vice provosts. And as Maggie has mentioned, the scope of the committee is broad because the breadth of the mission is being reflected. But it is also clear that this committee would want to work closely with finance and operations because the mission is supported by finance and operations, so I would expect this committee to be working closely with Brian Burnett's committee, and I would expect that I would be working closely with that committee as well, and with Brian on enrollment goals, student housing, things like that, that it clearly have financial and operational implications.
We're open to your questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much. And we will now open it to the floor. Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members, and Provost, Ms. Flatten. Yesterday, when we were discussing in the Finance and Operations Committee dealing with the employee contracts at different levels, it occurred to me why that discussion had not started in the Mission Fulfillment Committee as a matter of employment and conditions of employment, and then, if you will, referred to the Finance Committee for the money. Now, in our structure, we don't have any referrals. We go from the two major committees right to the full board, and it just seems to me that those contracts, in terms of employment, ought to happen in that committee as opposed to the Finance Committee. And you're all looking at me like, what is he talking about?
Regional Mari.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Rocha, Regent Johnson. That was part of some earlier conversation about how we would structure the committees, and the way that I think of it, which can also still lead to some confusion, is looking at the organizational chart. So if you look at Brian Burnett's direct reports, Kathy Brown comes under him, which does the negotiations of retirement and union contracts and that type of thing. And so having that flow up through the Finance and Operations Committee, from my understanding, is why it has been done in that way. Now, all of the faculty tenure approvals and conversations will come through the Mission Fulfillment Committee on the other side of things.
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson?
Follow up. I'm trying to, is there any situation where we might make a referral from mission fulfillment over to finance?
I would...
Is it not part of the way we do business now?
Well, Regent Johnson, as I sort of, perceive the new structure as I think, pretty well-defined work in progress at this point, it seems, and Mr. Chair, Regent McMillan can perhaps weigh in on this, there is the practical implication of it being identically composed of the 12 regions. And so from a technical standpoint, that certainly would be within our right to refer it, but to the extent we're referring it to ourselves, it'd be a function of whether that committee has the resources present to respond to a specific question. Regent McMillan, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't know if I can clarify, but I can talk about intent and how we, Mr. Steves and I, work to put this together, the new structure, and that is really following the organization chart of President Kaler's, with one side of Provost Hanson's side of the organization, if you will, delivering and developing and delivering the academic mission, and Vice President Burnett's side, Senior Vice President Burnett's side of the organization, supporting that. And I guess this is one where you're calling, it could fit in either. I think the fact that we're all 12 together in the morning, in the afternoon on Thursday should practically address the challenge, but if we needed for some reason to bring something through both committees, we could certainly follow Regent Johnson's referral, but everybody would have the chance in the morning or the afternoon yesterday to see it, hear it, understand it, and we could just note it, saying this could easily be in finance and ops, but let's talk about it here as part of an academic appointment and mission fulfillment.
Thank you. Regent Anderson?
Thank you, Chair Rocha. Interesting to me, I've just been enlightened, and I'm happy that I now know, because I have kind of wondered why some things are in finance and some are in mission fulfillment. But my colleague Regent Omari has pointed out that they follow the organizational chart, and that's something I did not know, but I think it makes all the sense in the world, and there is no reason to go in front of both committees because we are the same 12 people.
Thank you. Regent Simmons?
I fully agree with Regent Anderson on that point. And I would also just like to say the charge can only really define the scope of the work, and then the responsibility comes to, I think, all of us to make sure we use the committees well. And this is going to be a harder committee to use well. It's going to be obvious in finance and operations. There are things that we must attend to and have transaction on, budgets, capital requests, et cetera. But this is going to be different, and I think the burden is on all of us to make sure we are strategically using this committee. And for example, yesterday we had two very important agenda items, I thought, and I think on one we probably hit the mark, on one we may have missed the mark. And if I could just speak to that, the intent on the research agenda item was to make sure we understand more broadly what research is at the University of Minnesota, that it's more than NIH, industry, and National Science Foundation funding. It is discovery and creativity, and we better understand it happens in all the colleges. Or someday we'll make a decision that will have a negative impact on the mission. With respect to our conversation on outreach, I found it really informative, some of the things that are going on, and we'll definitely use the committee to be informative, but we never engaged together and said, is that what outreach should be? Is that what outreach, that's the scope of it? One of my colleagues, Regent Hsu, at one meeting of the board said, football is outreach. Is it? Decisions we make about a core mission activity, outreach is one of our 3 core missions, should be considered differently than something that may be more peripheral. So I think we could have had that discussion and we didn't. So I think the burden is on the committee leadership and fortunately the provost to help us, but then it's on all of us. If we've been thinking about that, make sure we have the right collective conversation.
Thank you, Regent Simmons. And I would just note over time, we'll probably eventually see which of those finance and operations or mission fulfillment is more effective at being able to get the entire board to support what they produce. So,
Or stay on time. We'll just
stay on time. Regent Beeson.
Thank you. I was related to Regent Simmons' comment. I didn't see in the list of committee duties the land grant and the extension. And Regent Roche and I talked about this at our preview meeting that is going to be a mission fulfillment topic, and that should be added on here. I didn't see it.
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, I wish to have my remarks and comments stricken from the record. It was really stupid and ignorant of me to bring it up.
Can we leave stupid and ignorant in there?
We're going to ask the board to ratify.
I wish to have a roll call vote.
That's right. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I do think this is important, and we're using the opportunity, whether it belongs in policy and governance or elsewhere, to talk about the committee structure. It's an iterative process. We're bringing it to life. I think it's working reasonably well, but the Finance and Operations Committee is much more transactional by its nature. We knew that going in. In fact, the volume of transactions there may feel overwhelming at times. Mission fulfillment has a few transactional elements, and Provost Hanson's pulled one of those up for us to consider. By and large, it's going to be more substantive and, what is our mission? So I think this is a good conversation. I don't know if we have time to take it all the way that we might want to, but the transactional nature of one committee and the less transactional was something that Mr. Steves and I thought about, and I socialized with some of you. It's coming to life. I am, as your chair, wide open to feedback, course corrections, refinements as we go. I think this is a learning process.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. And in our previous conversations, we talked about the symbiotic relationship between the two, and that eventually you're going to have mission fulfillment driving the financial operational decisions, and then the financial operational conditions will help us continue to refine this. So it seems to be that we're moving forward. This is a great conversation. We certainly can continue it amongst ourselves, but to try to get back on schedule as much as possible. I thank you very much for the presentation, and we will now move on to our next item, which is Board Approval Thresholds, Part 1. These are the principles for discussion. I would ask Senior Vice President Brian Burnett to join us, as well as Executive Director and Corporate Secretary Brian Steves. Gentlemen, the floor is yours. Start at will.
Mr. Chair, I know that you're short on time, and so we'll be efficient, because the goal of this session is really also to get feedback and input. Just to tee this up, with the restructure of the administration, there is some interest on their part, and also with the restructure of the board committees, I think there's also interest in taking an off-cycle look at not a comprehensive review of your reservation and delegation of authority policy, but a narrow look at the thresholds primarily contained within that policy, as well as a couple of other policies. And so that's really what this is set up to do today, is to start that conversation, gather some input so that it can inform a proposal that comes back. So as you'll see the timeline, today's discussion, then in December you'd see potential red line language on policy, and then action potentially in February. To start it off, we are submitting to you some principles that might be principles that would guide your thinking around this. It's very difficult to look at a list of thresholds and evaluate whether they are appropriately set or not. And so these may or may not be principles that you find helpful, but we're offering them as a potential starting point for the conversation. And that is, as you look at thresholds, do they continue to strengthen public confidence in the university's decision-making process? That could be an evaluation a lens you look at the thresholds through. Do they ensure board oversight of university operations that is right-sized and at the right level? As the university evolves over time, you may have different different determinations of what right-sized and at the right level is. One of my favorite examples always is to pull out those 1940s minutes and show you that the board had lengthy conversations about the toasters in the residence halls. And so at that time, that may be right-sized and at the right level, certainly not now. 3, to align the thresholds for consistency across types of projects and purchases. I think when we look at the thresholds, you might look at them and say, why are these the way they are? And it may be because this lens hasn't been applied. And then finally, to avoid surprises or that have the potential to create public relations risk. We've all certainly seen instances in the Chronicle where boards have been surprised by some decision that occurred that was below a threshold and then decided we're going to change that threshold. So it's those kinds of things. So those are kind of a backdrop to your conversation. You could reject them, you can accept them, you can use them how you wish for the conversation, but it's to give you some foundation to start from. And I won't go through it in great detail. It's outlined in your docket materials. You have this information in front of you, but it gives you a sense of the scope of thresholds that you have currently set in board policy. They range from $250,000 on the low end to $5 million on the high end. You can see, based on the colors, the kinds of thresholds each of these are. There are lower thresholds, for instance, around capital plans and budgets, as well as around retirement plans and commercialization of technology issues. There's kind of a medium set around goods and service purchases and real property transactions, and then higher level thresholds related to some other facilities items. And then the one in orange is this umbrella language, and we'll touch on that at the very end as well. But the umbrella language it kind of applies across everything, and it sets a $2 million threshold, and it has some other language related to it. And so we can save that because we'll have a question about that one at the end. So with that.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, good morning. Quite frankly, just to kick this off, as we look to developing recommendations for your consideration at your December meeting, we would appreciate your input on these questions. Do these current thresholds strike the right balance between your responsibility to provide sufficient oversight and the amount of time required to thoughtfully consider an act? And how important is this alignment across various thresholds on like items? Is it, I think it's just a good, I think the graphic in the prior slide, it was really well done by board staff to illustrate just how maybe unintentional it's become over time with just past practice. And what's the board's appetite for potentially raising these thresholds, and does it vary by type of transaction? And would it differ if the item was being approved or competitively bid? I will tell you that I've worked at institutions where the thresholds are different if it was sole source versus competitively bid, because as long as we're following the policies of the institution about bidding and a bid was awarded, there isn't any approval process, because we could have a long discussion about injecting a body like this into what would be a competitively awarded public bidding process. And boards that I've served in the past have felt like that was not a place where it was in their best interest to weigh in. But when it was a sole source, it felt different to them. So we just throw those out today. I don't think there's any right answer. I don't think there's any perfect. And part of it is the culture of and the history of this institution and the board that governs it. So I think those are the things we wanted to just put in front of you today. Listen, give some thoughts. I don't think we have any burning issues that have to get solved. I would tell you to Brian's point about the umbrella, that's the one we brought with you on the TCF agreement. When that was really money coming in, it wasn't money being spent by the university, but it was $2 million. It was high visibility, and so we felt like it fit the umbrella designation when we brought that to you for approval last month.
And Mr. Chair, I've just put the slide up as well that actually contains that umbrella language, so you can see it. It's a little bit involved to explain, so I just put it in front of you. And the questions around that one are simply: is the language clear enough to determine when the threshold has been met, and kind kind of jumping off of a conversation that this board previously had, is there interest in specifying that administrative employment agreements would be subject to the umbrella language in some fashion?
Thank you, gentlemen. To kind of set the conversation up a little bit, as you all know, this is a conversation that has been going on in some form here for quite some time, and it arose from this conversation about compensation, salary issues, and as you know, my plain reading of the language is being that it is a contract for services. It falls under this, but this is what we're really trying to get at as a clarification, because in that process we discovered that there's a range of approval authorities, which for me anyway, as a first blush, seemed strange, and it made me wonder if it was just sort of something that had developed over time, as Vice President Burnett had commented. In that research, you start to understand a little bit more why there were different treatments, and so it wasn't like it was entirely random. There are some pretty good bases for these different perspectives, but we'd open it to the board for conversation. I'll turn to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for placing this on the work agenda and starting it off early in our year. It is this is an interesting visual when you see the chart, it raises more questions than probably answers them. I agree with Regent Rocha. When you study them, there are reasons, I think, for those thresholds. I personally advocate for higher thresholds. When you step way back, we are a $4 billion organization, but I also like different thresholds for different areas. For example, commercial goods and services, I would like to see a higher threshold. In my 8-9 years on the board, we've really, the items that come before us in those areas are highly technical. They're usually budgeted, or often competitively bid. We're not unnecessarily slowing down those decisions, because we do meet at least every other month, so I don't think it's fatal that we have lower thresholds, but it does cost money when we have lower thresholds. So I'd like to see those raised. The other hand, on real estate, I like lower thresholds, especially selling real estate. That's an irreversible decision. Any amount of real estate could be really a big problem. So lower thresholds on real estate. You know my opinion on thresholds for hiring staff. I happen to like the current sort of listing of senior officials, but I'm open to conversation about some dollar threshold there as well.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Rocha and Vice Chair Beeson. My comments are just one of thank you and to Mr. Steves. As we were wrestling through the application of this array of thresholds back in July, it was this chart I had in mind. I didn't know what it would look like, but bringing it all to one place. So I won't weigh in with thoughts or opinions right now. I think there could be another color there for people contracts, perhaps. That would be another one. I don't know where we go, but this is the tool we need to sort this out. So thank you.
Thank you. Regent Simmons.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. This is really helpful. I appreciate it so much. There are two questions that I'll just put out there that are in my mind that maybe you'll address as you do any revision. One is when we look at these financial thresholds, what's the time frame associated with them? So there's some contracts, service contracts would be one, where it may be $1 million a year for 5 years or something, and where does that fall? Is it fall under the $1 million or the $5 million threshold? I don't know. The other question is under the umbrella one. That seems to be could be interpreted as anything that costs $2 million would hit that. So some of our contracts with people would hit that. Do they belong there, or are people and hires going to be done separately? So that would need some clarity, or we'll be in the same conversation we've been having for the last year plus. And again, the time frame question comes. So you could again, whether it's you're picking a service and contracting for it or hiring a person and contracting with them, over time, the contract may be worth $10 million. And so where does that go?
Thank you. Vice President Burnett?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Simmons, I think that it's my experience in my first year here is that the administration takes a very conservative view. So if a multi-year contract exceeds $1 million, it's coming to you. Like the toilet paper and paper towels yesterday, right? And so, and how much value does that add? I mean, okay, it's interesting, but is it really where you should be spending your time? I think those are the kinds of questions. So my impression since being here is anything that gets close to touching these thresholds, our staff has erred on bringing it to the board. It's not the other way. And so I think they want to be thoughtful about this as well, because it's just a historical practice of keeping the board, and it is a trust level between the administration and the board. So I think that anything that gets close to the way I've seen it been practiced over the last, if it's a multi-year and it crosses $1,001, then it's coming. If not, so I think it's just the overall value of the contract, but we can make sure we clarify that next month.
Which does beg the question, Vice President Burnett, how expensive were those toasters back in 1940?
I didn't check on the toaster contract.
I do want to make one comment in response. We use the word trust again. I think it's really dangerous to suggest that oversight, which may be a function of just public perception, I don't want to make any implication that this number means we trust someone more versus this number. I think it has to do with other implications, and so I don't want to charge it with that.
I didn't mean to, Mr. Chairman. I agree.
That understanding. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Rocha, and thank you for clarifying that. I agree, because oftentimes it's not about trust, it's just about not being confident because we don't know. Right, and that brings me directly to the competitive bidding process that Senior Vice President brought up. I think in theory, when there's a competitive bidding process, perhaps it might not make sense for it to come to us. But I don't know enough about the competitive bidding process to have to make a stance on that. And I find frequently that a competitive bidding process has one bidder. And I don't know if that qualifies as a competitive bidding process, because I'm not the person who does the competitive bidding. I was happy and also surprised to hear that there were 13 bidders on the paper transaction that we approved yesterday. Very surprised, actually, even though I know that we're improving in time of RFPs and sourcing RFPs and so on and so forth. So I would like to see more information, in many ways a historical track of how we are doing bidding, and whether or not we're accepting bids that are too high in price across the board, construction, goods and services, so on and so forth.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. My comment refers to financial support for commercialization of technology. Don't have a lot of knowledge of that, our specific practices in that area, but want to observe that we know that is a very high risk area. Most ventures here fail. Nevertheless, I think it's good that we provide some support to try to commercialize. The board may want to consider not only the threshold level, but also capping the total level of investment in this area, given that it is, very high risk. And I think a cap would be common practice at other venture funds if you look at private industry.
Vice President Burnett.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Powell, we can certainly have Dr. Levine talk about that next month or at your next meeting with the research, because that really falls under his area. I believe it has to stay within the budgeted funds if they're using university funds, so they wouldn't be spending money they don't have. But I think you're right on this one. When you're talking about financial support to non-university entities, that probably argues for a smaller threshold than some of these other ones that maybe could use to be raised given the current enterprise value of the University of Minnesota.
President Kaler, would you like to make some remarks?
Thank you, Chair Rocha. To Regent Powell's question, I believe, but am not 100% certain, that in fact in the technology investment funds that we have set, that we do have a cap. I think it's $350,000.
I don't have a policy with respect to the hires, but if there's an umbrella that would have somebody who's not on that list flip into this because of the dollar amount. I'm not happy with that because I think people should be handled differently than these sorts of transactions. That's my rotten opinion.
Thank you. And yeah, and I've got Regent Hsu on the list here, but I do want to respond to that comment in particular, because this was I think a good conversation that the Vice Chair and I had as we were talking about this, because he raised the same issue about concern about, employment contracts. In this particular case, it was dealing with folks that were involved with athletics, and I said, well, I really don't have an issue with the contracts for people that are in athletics. I have an issue with employment contracts generally. And I don't really have an issue with contracts generally. I have an issue with contracts. It's about risk. It's about dollar amounts. And so I don't separate the contract for custodial paper from a contract for employment. From the public perspective, $1 million is $1 million. The issue is risk. In fact, there's more risk in an employment contract than there is with these janitorial or with custodial paper, because if something goes wrong with custodial paper, you can go back after the vendor. If an employee doesn't work out, you don't really recover what you've paid for the employee's performance. So for me, it's about risk. And so to the extent, and on that point, when we had this discussion a few months ago, it was pointed out that, well, we don't want the board to be approving every faculty hire. We do. We don't grant tenure without board approval. And why does the board approve that? Because there is a substantial investment. There's a risk of granting that very powerful status to a faculty member. And so our predecessors have said that is going to come to the board before we put the university at that level of commitment and risk. So just understanding that. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Rocha. I want to echo your comments because I was going to make those, but I do have one question regarding the thresholds. Are these all of the thresholds that we have, or are there other ones that are just not on here?
Mr. Steves.
Mr. Chair, Regent Rocha, these are all of the thresholds that are outlined in reservation delegation of authority and a couple of other policies. We believe this is comprehensive, though I wouldn't want to suggest that it's possible there's some other one that didn't make it on this chart, but I believe this is comprehensive.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Steves, I seem to recall that Central Reserves policy does have a threshold in there in terms of whether or not it needs to be approved. I think it's at $250,000, but I'm not sure. So I was just wondering, because that's one that I can think of that I don't see here. So,
Mr. Steves.
Mr. Chair and Regent Hsu, we can take a look and update it as appropriate.
Thank you. Regent Simmons, an additional comment?
Yes, please. I wanted to say I agree with your comment that dealing with people versus stuff, there's really a different risk threshold. There's really a different risk to consider, and I don't know how best to do it, but that's why I separate people from things and from things and services. So I fully agree.
Well, thank you. And in a segue, if there aren't any additional, and we are running out of time. Segue into my comments on that is that I tend to see, when we look at the list that Regent Beeson referred to earlier of the various administrators, the various folks that we vote on, my understanding, my belief as you look at that list is that list is not really about financial risk. That's about the importance of those positions to this institution, that the decisions that these folks will be making are so important to the success of the organization that we have that conversation as a board. That's why I tend to look at the financial threshold as being in addition to that delineation, as opposed to vacated by the list. And so again, I talked about tenure already. This is really about a very thoughtful process to decide what is appropriate from the public's perspective as well as a governance perspective. In doing this, my bias is I generally start with all of these at $1 million, because when I think about my cousins sitting out in Stearns County, when they hear $1 million, it's kind of the Dr. Evil moment from Austin Powers. $1 million is a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that I'm unwilling to move. You may come in and say, in this area with the commercialization of technology, maybe we need to have something a little more reserved. But then in some of the real estate, and we had a wonderful conversation, Regent Beeson and I, with Mr. Steves about how the real estate, some of the real estate, or the modifications rather, schematic plans and so on, as a practical matter, the risk is relatively low. We've already made certain approvals. We'll have final approval. So there is some way of reaching that. I suggested that, being that everybody has different opinions on these things, ranked choice voting may be necessary for us to come up with some numbers. But my expectation, Mr. Regent Simmons, one last comment?
Maybe we continue our banter a little bit, because I find it helpful. When we do approve people, we are approving a compensation package or a contract, if you will. So we should be attentive to the financial implications as well as the strategic mission implications. And with respect to these thresholds, I just want to make sure that umbrella is easy to understand, and so that the next time it comes up, I won't say, well, because of the dollar amount it comes under here, and somebody else say, no, we deal with that on hiring personnel differently. So we need clarity.
I think that's absolutely right, and I appreciate Vice President Burnett and President Kaler. The enterprise has been to be sensitive and ensuring that there is that information. I know that the board leadership has been part of those conversations as well. Are there any further comments from members of the committee? President Kaler.
Thank you. I'm more than eager to hear this committee, Chairman Rocha, tell our team that you would like to see a revised and comprehensive level setting that eliminates the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of different things, and to get some appropriate level setting for different things at different times. So we would like to bring to you some suggestions of how we'd like to reset some of these levels, if you would be willing to entertain those.
I think on behalf of the committee that would be very well received.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We will now move to our last item, information items for discussion. Mr. Steves, you still have the floor. You need something up here? Doing it from up here?
I guess so.
All right.
You went so fast.
I'm trying to make up time. I've got to gain 2 minutes into the past. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, just for information, in your docket is a board policy that has been reviewed, and no changes have been recommended. As you'll recall, when we discussed the work plan, the idea was that when there were such policies, that this committee would have an opportunity to just take a look at them, and if you certainly had comments or questions about them, we could discuss that. Otherwise, they will simply go back into the comprehensive review cycle for their next time around.
Comment? All right. That was an information item. If there are any comments regarding that information item, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And we are adjourned. Yeah.